on school funding representing the education community in Northumberland, and we're here in our representative roles for each part of that community rather than our individual roles. Also a reminder that Schools Forum is a public meeting, it is recorded and it is made available for public access. Thank you. So if we move on to the first item on the agenda, please, that's membership and membership update.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Just in terms of today's meeting, we've obviously over the course of the last probably 12-18 months been seeking additional representation, additional members on Schools Forum in terms of again, given the situation we're in, we are currently carrying vacancies. I'm delighted we've got a couple of observers to today's meeting with a view to subsequently joining Schools Forum, and they are obviously Gillian Linklater, who's head at Collingwood School in Morpeth. Welcome, Gillian. And also Steve Gibson, who's the head of the Bellingham Partnership across the first and middle schools in Bellingham. Thanks for joining this meeting this morning, and we'll be delighted to hopefully subsequently welcome you to Forum as official members should that opportunity arise, and should your interest be maintained more hopefully.
Yep, welcome to both of you. Okay, have we any apologies for absence?
We've had apologies from Dave Cookson, Warwick Stevenson, Graham Atkins, who sent John Riley as a substitute, and Hannah Brown.
Okay, thanks, Luke. Next item, disclosure of interest. Just a reminder, if you have any interests of any of the items, please to disclose them as we go through that item. Thank you. So if we can now review the minutes and matters arising, which are pages 3 to 10 in your agenda pack. I'll just go through it page by page in case there's anything anyone wants to raise. Page 1. Page 2. Page 3. Page 4. Page 5. Page 6. And page 7. So if there's no corrections or anything matters arising that aren't covered in the agenda, are you happy for me to sign those as a true record?
True record, Chair.
Thank you very much. Okay, if we now move on to item 5 on the agenda, which is communication. Bruce.
Nothing specifically to share around communications to this meeting, Chair. Obviously, this meeting is essentially the one key agenda item looking at the settlement data around the dedicated schools grant we received just before Christmas, and which is obviously laid out in the next agenda item.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. So if we can move straight on to that, please.
Okay. Yeah, I'm assuming I'm more than happy to share my screen, but I'm assuming everybody has sort of sight of the papers, is able to have a copy of the report in front of them. So unless I hear otherwise, I'll simply continue as we are. So we received the settlement data on the 17th of December with a Merry Christmas from the Department for Education, and the values are as set out in the table on page 12 of the agenda pack, the second page of the report. There's further information there in terms of at the link shared on page 11, but I think it's probably the important thing to stress is that sort of looking specifically at the schools block initially, while an increase of 9.6 or just under 4% may seem, I'm certainly not going to use the term generous, but sort of adequate when compared to inflation and peer settlements, it's important to remember that that's not a like-for-like comparison, and we've laid that out at the top of page 2 of the report. Essentially, there are 2 grants who have now been rolled into the schools block DSG, namely the National Insurance contributions grant and the school's budget support grant that were being paid separately during the current sort of financial year. So it's important that we essentially take account of those when sort of making a true comparison. Essentially, I've attempted to do that in terms of rolling the figures in for this year, and what it then shows is essentially that a more accurate representation of the schools block for Northumberland is that it's gone up by just under 1%, by 0.97%, £2.4 million. There is continued additional investment in high needs with a 8.6% increase, but we all know the situation both locally and nationally in relation to high needs. Central services block again looks as if it's a larger increase, but again some of that is down to the rolling in of those grants we've talked about above. And early years, as with an extension of the 2-year-old and under 2-year-old offer accounts for that significant £11.6 million rise. And obviously there's more details in the report later in terms of the early years elements. Again, and without wishing to sound like a stuck record, it's important to emphasise that the biggest pressure on Northumberland's sort of schools block DSG comes from falling numbers in mainstream schools. We reported that last year, where essentially we had a fall of 607 in terms of the mainstream school population between reception and year 11. That again has been repeated in terms of this year to the tune of 529, and we're seeing it across both primary and secondary. Two key reasons for that, and again to try to put I've put some financial context to that at the top of page 3. That essentially means that we're getting £3 million less than we would have done had our pupil numbers remained the same, remained stable. And as I've said before, so much of the school funding is distributed on a per capita, per head basis. That's got an impact across all of our schools, but particularly where clearly there's a fall in row. Trying to sort of be more precise. Hi, James.
Sorry, Bruce, and apologies if this is sort of buried somewhere in the report. Are there any patterns to that fall in birth rate geographically across the county? Not that it matters, because I know it's everybody's money, but where is that most pronounced?
Excuse me, James.
Sorry, Bruce, do you want me to come in there?
If yes, in terms of the
sorry, I didn't get a chance. Sorry, James. In terms of the numbers, it is predominantly across the whole of the county that we're seeing a fall in the birth rate, but particularly in the far west of the county and the far north. That's where we're having significant impact, and you'll definitely see that from the number of applications we've had for reception places this year. So it's really hitting our first and primary sector, I think, next year, really across the county. It's a little bit better for secondary at the minute. We've still got some of those higher numbers coming through, but you can see in future years the impact that our first and primary colleagues are going to be experiencing are going to follow through to the secondary provision. And I'm sure colleagues on the call will be feeling that themselves.
Thanks, Sue.
Yeah, just to say, James, as well, we're just in the process of rewriting our school organisation plan. That will be going to fact scrutiny in March. So there'll be a whole raft of new data coming out sort of like later on this year, again, that we can share with Forum in a presentation if you wish, or we'll just circulate for information, but that will back up probably some of the high level things I've just said in detail. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue. And obviously just picking up Sue's point there, the first bullet point makes the point that, again, it's we are seeing a shift, that we are getting lower numbers in terms of primary. The year 11 group we lost in terms of, in July 2025, essentially was 3,130 students. But the replacement reception class coming in September was 2,828. So that again, that accounts for more than half of that reduction. There's 302 students, in terms of lost at that point. And again, being explicit around it, the continuing shift into special schools and special school settings, they're outside of the schools block clearly in terms of, so they don't generate funding within the schools block. There is an element of special school places attracting formula funding through the high needs block. But again, from the point of view of these overall schools block and our mainstream schools, that accounts, that increase of 164 would account for the large other element in terms of the loss. There are other contributory factors in terms of permanent exclusion increases, EHE, but essentially it comes down to those two key factors really. Happy to move on. You will be aware, and Schools Forum are reminded, we went out to schools in terms of a consultation on funding for 26-27, and that was carried out in November, between the 25th of November and the 17th of December. Slightly disappointingly, we only had 5 responses received, and essentially we've summarised the key findings from those responses below. In line with, again, the Schools Forum decision, there was clear support for a 0.5% transfer from the schools block to the high needs block, in line with the previous Schools Forum decision. But, again, that was reduced and more mixed when talking about any sort of larger transfer later on. And that, again, that mirrors very much the findings in terms of last year. We sought views in terms of a review of top-up bandings, but there was no clear consensus around that. But it was interest, particularly in relation to the consideration of school balances. But there was support for continuing some level of top-up support for those students with SEN needs, at SEN support level, but who don't have education, health and care plans. So again, we'll consider that. And also for the school level additional notional SEN payments, where essentially they've exhausted their element 2 £6,000 funding. And again, finally, in terms of the bottom bullet point there, the principle we've always tried to sort of maintain in Northumberland, that to minimise the chance of a fall in per pupil funding for all schools, setting the minimum funding guarantee level at the highest potential level. Now, when you talk about setting at the highest potential level, it's 0 in the overall in the DFE funding regulations anyway, but nevertheless we have done so at that in the proposals for this year. Okay, any questions? Can we continue at that point? Section 5 of the report essentially lays out in more details the early years block settlement and the indicative parts of that. Infamously, even when historically we used to receive earlier information in relation to the schools block, early years was the figures that was always simply dropped in the December settlement, and that was the first sight we've got of it. What we're doing in terms of around early years, in terms of working, with providers, whether schools in terms of, pre-reception nurseries or working with PVI providers, is essentially trying to look for early settlement around proposed rates for 26-27 in order to give, all providers the maximum opportunity to sort of plan services for next year. I'm looking, it's unfortunate slightly, I can't see Debbie, the early years rep, with us this morning, but that's something that discussions with the sector previously has emphasised, and obviously we're endeavouring to do that. There's 5 key funding principles for 26-27 in terms of maximising base rates, maintaining a deprivation supplement for 3- and 4-year-olds, and introducing that to the 2-year-olds as well in terms of equivalency. They're also striving to maintain the SEND Inclusion Fund, the SENIF, based on previous life spend, and also providing a contingency to mitigate the risks in relation to termly census points. And that's an important one in terms of changes for this year, that historically the January census was king in relation to the early years funding. It was always based around the sort of January census points, both retrospectively and sort of in year. The key change this year is essentially it's moving to taking into consideration all of the census points when sort of, in terms of in relation to the early years funding. So again, there's additional information in relation to the report, sort of going down from the bottom, page 4. Probably important to highlight the pass-through rate. The pass-through rate has risen. Historically, it's been 95%, but it was obviously 95% of a smaller pool of funding. That meant that essentially a maximum of 5% could be retained for, administration essentially of the grant. Historically, Northumberland's always had a higher rate than 95% in terms of pass-through, even though the requirement, because of the overall grant increases, the requirement pass-through rate has increased as well. But the estimate is for Northumberland that essentially, with a minimum requirement of 97%, it's going to be around 97.9% for 26-27. Obviously, there has been a deprivation supplement in the early years funding formula for a number of years now, but with the extension of the 2-year-old offer, again, we're replicating that across the 2-year-olds, giving some equivalency to what's happening at the, what's always happened historically in relation to 3- and 4-year-olds. Again, maintaining the inclusion funding and having a budget of 183,000 in relation to that. And that point at the top of page 15 or page 5 of this report is that point around the census changes. It's important that Schools Forum and Motorpoint, our early years providers, are aware of that, and that will be communicated. Importantly, the table on page 15 of the agenda pack shows the proposals for the hourly rates in 26-27. That information is hopefully self-evident. I don't intend to say anything more in relation to that, other than re-emphasising the point we made before about the the importance of sort of being able to communicate this at the earliest possible opportunity to our EY providers. So essentially, year on year, it's looking at an average increase of 5.17%. Before we go to the sort of, the specific notes for Schools Forum, Callum Street, can I just ask, is there anything, I know you've been involved to an extent with EY, is there anything you would like to add or any additional points you want to make in relation to EY funding?
Not really, just that perhaps that the way that it gets monitored will be going in termly, and it's important to kind of acknowledge that, and it will be a changing beast in terms of the financing. We are given 2 rates, and I think it was that with the pass-through, we're comfortably within the pass-through kind of limits with everything that we're doing there. So passing on certainly more than we were last year. I'm looking to continue to kind of building on that.
Okay. Thanks, Callum. And again, just picking up Alan's point at the start of the meeting, essentially where sort of this isn't a formal decision for Schools Forum around the rates, but where, we're again, in line with good practice, we're sort of consulting and highlighting the, the proposed rates for 26-27. And that's why it's formally recorded as a note rather than a recommendation for agreement. So essentially, we're increasing the 3- and 4-year-old rate with a 40% uplift to £5.90. 30% uplift to the 2-year-old rate is £7.85. 45 pence to the under 2s rate, again, which is higher at £10.70. Early years pupil premium will increase £1.15 an hour, and the Disability Access Fund to £975 actually annually. And you see all that fits in is laid out in the calculations at the Annex 1 of the report. And while we're maintaining the deprivation supplement for 3 and 4-year-olds and then reducing that for 2-year-olds. Stops, pauses for breath. Are there any other queries in relation to that? Good. Okay. Again, high needs total block funding. We've highlighted the increase in terms of being the 8.6% uplift. That's the gross figure attributed to the county. We then have sort of deductions for direct funding or recoupment, as it's called, in terms of ISA in relation to pre and post 16 posts and academies, post 16 and maintained special schools, and other independent learning providers and specialist placements. So that accounts for 4.478 million of the overall allocation. So there's funds available after that of 59.3. In line with the decision to transfer 0.5% of the schools block, that means there's an additional 1.271 million transferred into the high needs block, resulting in the total high needs funding available of £60,591,038. I think I've taken the liberty of rounding some pence off the end of that, so please indulge me in respect of that. And again, as in previous years, we'll bring more detailed budgets in relation to the high needs block, including what we think the potential gap will be for 26-27 to the February meeting. Okay, moving on. Section 7 of the report, schools block funding. Again, in terms of the schools block, it's important to remind all forum members of the lag nature. When the primary and secondary units of funding are set, essentially they are based on previous data. And while the Schools Forum has unwaveringly supported the work done over the course of the last couple of summers around increasing free school meal numbers, what it meant was last year we were in a position where we could no longer fund at national funding formula, even using capping and scaling. We had to drop rates to approximately 1% under that. We have seen an increase in the primary unit of funding and the secondary unit of funding figure, which essentially has enabled us to halve the gap to around 0.5% for the proposals for the current year. But as you can see, those elements make up by far the major part of the grant. Just under 250 million out of the 254.5 million. There's two other small elements then made up in terms of the growth funding allocated to local authorities. And as I outlined previously, what Northumberland has done is put the vast majority of that into the formula funding to enable us to maximise the rates as highly as possible. With the one proviso that we've had to make a small element in terms of growth fund payment for proposals which are laid out further down in the report. And essentially the premises figures of 3.4 million, which again are reflected in the overall settlement. Rates of deduction. Northumberland is a central billing authority, so essentially we manage the rates between Northumberland as the billing authority and the DFE directly on behalf of all of our schools, both maintained and academies, which again is far more administratively efficient in relation to that. As we've outlined, essentially the again, November Schools Forum agreed the 0.5% transfer. The actual settlement received was some 2.363 million less than the previous indicative allocations. And again, all I'm going to do at that point is underline the dangers and the concerns I've had and expressed previously around some of the indicative allocations that are previously published based on previous pupil numbers, and that would be the prime reason for the gap, but also the rolling of the grants at that point as well. It's important to outline in terms of as part of the, Sue's already touched on the school organisation plan. We've identified a need for 20 additional Year 7 places within the Seaton Valley area, Seaton Valley High School, all from terms of, in catchment demand. In line with the growth policy, we're proposing to fund those at ORPU and ORPU only. And so we need to make provision for those additional places for 7/12 of the year from September 2026. The cost is estimated at £66,000, which is, outlined as only a small element of the growth front of the £1.1 million allocated in terms of the growth fund. But nevertheless, we're seeking specifically Schools Forum approval in relation to that. Probably important to highlight as well, we've got the table there with
sorry Bruce, Ben's raised his hand.
Apologies, Ben. Yeah.
Sorry, it was just a very minor one. Just it's not Year 7 places, it's Year 9 places.
It is at Seaton Valley being 3-tier. Apologies, Ben. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
At again page 20 of the agenda pack, you've got essentially a very one-page table outlining the national funding formula values, both for the current and next financial year, and what the Northumberland proposed values are. I've added that end column, which essentially shows the difference between the national funding formula values and the Northumberland values. But essentially, it's it's important that it is progress. We are closing the gap, but unable to fund those fully. With the current settlement, sadly. The one thing I would like to highlight as well in terms of relation to that, the proposal is that we fund the free school meal rate at the full national funding formula rate. There is a small cost to that within the formula, estimated at £27,000. But the rationale and the principle behind that was we've done so much work in terms of increasing school meals numbers because of the benefits to the overall formula. Schools, of course, have to meet those requirements when a student is identified for free school meals. They can't wait for the lagged funding to come along 18 months later. So it felt appropriate and fair at that point to fund those free school meals, to support schools in relation to that, and fund those free school meal elements specifically at the full free national funding formula rate. I hope that Schools Forum is supportive and happy of that, and happy with that. But there was a clear rationale for doing that. Given that schools have to wait because of the lag nature of the funding, we didn't want to penalise them further in relation to that. Okay. As reported at the November meeting, we had 2 disapplication requests lodged with the DFE dealing with the reorganisation in Berwick and the exceptional rent costs of over 1%. The exceptional rent costs, we received early notification that had been accepted, and last week as well we received notification of the disapplication request in relation to Berwick was approved too. You will recall that that's simply about moving funding when the middle schools close in in August 2026. Essentially, they're going to be funded for part of the year, for 5 months of the year. And then, when the Year 6 students are retained by the primary schools and the Year 7 and 8s are essentially added to the role at Berwick Academy, the funding's transferred accordingly. That isn't, and a disapplication request was required for that. But again, the DFE have outlined their approval. Again, in terms of the specifics and the regulations, we sought delegated power for the executive director and cabinet member to agree the final values. That was important given that we hadn't received them until the 17th of December. A report was taken to cabinet on the 13th of January on that basis, and following final approval by the DFE, they will be they'll be signed off essentially on that basis. But we don't anticipate any changes to the proposals that again are outlined in this report, and will be submitted to the DFE over the next day. Okay, again, our requirement is that we inform Maintain schools of their budget shares by the end of February, by the 28th of February, sort of 2026, and we will do that using the sort of e-courier circulation. As in previous years, the proposal would be to include the academies indicatively in that, but obviously the final budget shares to the academies is subject to the final ratification and notification by the DFE. And I think they're required to do that by the end of March in terms of the current timetable. I'll take further advice on that. Before we come back to the recommendations, again, we'll just look at some of go through the appendices. In terms of the keynotes there, in terms of obviously the schools block settlement and the reduction in terms of transfer to the high needs block. Note 4 obviously deals with, I know there is some sort of keen anticipation and interest in the indicative figures to schools at this point. I have to stress that they are still clearly indicative at this point. We require final DFE approval. I am able to share sort of outline figures at this meeting, and so an Appendix C will be circulated and shared with schools forum papers following this meeting. Essentially, if I share my screen now, just bear with me. The table, and again, we'll circulate this following the meeting. Essentially, the table is lists Maintain schools first and then academies, outlining the post-MFG budget for the current year, and then the figures for being proposed for 26-27. Please note that again, every page will say it's draft figures subject to DFE approval. You can see there again the drop in the pupil numbers. And essentially, those figures per school will be listed and shared following this meeting. My key sort of message, as ever, in relation to school funding will be, unfortunately, it's still very much a bums on seats business, and the sort of maintaining and or increasing the role is key, and you'll see that's evident in the figures when circulated. Okay. Just going back to the agenda pack. Dedelegation. Again, in terms of in relation to mainstream Maintain school members, there is a formal requirement for us to seek agreement to the proposals for the dedelegated rates for 2026-27. There essentially is no changes in the proposals around the services funded for Maintain schools through dedelegation in terms of both the sort of contingency around reorganisation, the determination of free school meals eligibility, the trade union facility time, and services for students with English as an additional language, which again, reflects that there's an additional element in the funding formula for that. As in previous years, we have strived to maintain rates at the same rate as previously, and that is possible in relation to 3 of the 4 services. However, having undertaken a review in terms of the trade union facility time, in order to balance funding expenditure and income on a year-on-year basis, it's proved necessary to seek an increase in those rates from £3.25 to £5. Again, that rate of £3.25 had been in place since I was involved in Schools Forum starting in 2017. And again, it reflects both, I think, additional demands being placed upon the service, certainly increases in activity, to reflect that. There is a paper provided at Appendix B in relation to that. Outlining with, sort of more details in terms of the demands placed upon that, which hopefully members have had the chance to review. Key element that, as with some of the other sort of services in terms of carry forwards, as a implication of the DFE regulations around the statutory override and HM Treasury's regulations around the statutory override. Because the DSG is consolidated as one block on the local authority balance sheet, it hasn't been possible to carry forward funding either in relation to trade union facility time, and that's another key reason why we're essentially looking for it to balance on an in-year basis. The EAL service, where historically Schools Forum may remember we brought requests for carry forwards, for approval for carry forwards forward. We're simply not able to do that in terms of under the current regulations in relation to that. So, are there any questions in relation to the delegation decision? Sorry, Mike, I see you've got your hand there.
That's all right, Bruce, thank you. Just a question on, is there any information on the take-up of non-maintained schools of that offer? Because obviously maintained schools, it's dedelegation, but non-maintained academies and so forth can choose. So I just wondered if there is any information about is there a decreasing number of obviously maintained schools as schools academise, bearing the cost of the delegated funds against non-maintained? Are they taking it up? Are they finding these services elsewhere?
There is increasing take-up, and again, that's evident to an extent in the report because, again, there's two key income streams. There's the de-delegated income, and then there's the income raised through the SLA. And the report at Appendix B shows that the SLA income is rising and continuing to rise over time. I'm going to pass to somebody far more informed on this than I am in terms of Joanne.
Mike, the take-up's been steady and consistent for a number of years. So the balance in terms of the maintained schools and de-delegation has shifted more towards the academies, because obviously we've seen a shift in terms of movement to academisation. So the funds have essentially just moved, but they have stayed consistent.
Yeah, if I can just add, I mean, I'll raise this under any other business because I've had some conversations with trade union colleagues, but I think essentially there's only one larger trust doesn't buy back into facilities time. So I think the answer, Mike, is the overwhelming majority of academy trusts do actually buy into facilities time.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Sorry, I've got builders on site and they just rang at the end of that. But thank you for answering the question.
No problem. Yeah, that's not a service we're looking to deliver under de-delegation yet, unfortunately. But yeah. So, again, section 9 of the report, page 12. Just again, notification in terms of the central school services block allocation. We are pursuing additional support in relation to the historic element of the central school services block, and we're waiting for further information from the DFE in relation to that. So any subsequent settlement, any initial settlement will hopefully be revised in relation to some of the evidence we've submitted. Okay. Just in terms of the appendices, as you say, Annex 1 essentially represents the grant on a page. That's my go-to. Hopefully that will be helpful for all concerned in terms of useful summary in terms of the paper. I'm not going to dwell anymore on at this point. The Appendix A essentially carries the detail of the school funding consultation results for anybody again wanting to dig into the detail of that anymore. And the Appendix B, as I said, is Joanne's paper in relation to the trade union facility time. Changes proposed in relation to that, and again, while it was the Appendix C was essentially the holding spot in the report, and I'll circulate the indicative provisional figures on an individual school basis following this meeting, and that'll obviously be placed with Schools Forum papers on the website as well. Before we take the formal recommendations, are there any other queries or questions in relation to the paper? Okay, great. Well, let's move on. Specifically, we're asking more generally, we're asking Schools Forum simply to note the information presented this morning in relation to the 26-27 dedicated schools grant settlement, and specifically for our maintained maintain mainstream school representatives were asking for essentially agreement to the 4 elements of the de-delegated 4 de-delegated elements of the funding, both in relation. So if we go through those on a line by line basis, just bear with me. Can I ask for your agreement essentially to the contingency element at £20 a pupil, which again has been held as in previous years? Essentially, Mike and James, I can see nods there. Yeah. Again, determination of free school meals eligibility. You know, some of that's contributed to the work we've undertaken in the past in terms of increasing numbers. Mike, James, thank you. The EAL service, again, that's not across all pupils. It's specifically those students who are registered and recorded as EAL in the school census data, who obviously also attract additional funding way over that unit rate. Again, yep, thank you. And last but not least, the increase in the trade union facility time rate on a basis of £5 per student for 26-27. Okay, Mike, James, thank you. Okay, that concludes that element of the report. Thank you. The only final paper is essentially the the schedule of meetings for the remainder of the year. I am conscious, and I apologise at this point, that we still have that Wednesday, the July meeting in for the last week of term. Luke, can we get together at some stage following this meeting and before the February one to look for an alternative in relation to that? Because I think the consensus was that the last week of term, it's really nice to get together, and I think that's something we would still want to advocate. But I understand the problems that last week of term presents to head teachers, so we will look to move that and bring notice of that to hopefully the February meeting with a revised schedule. Okay.
Thank you, Bruce. I think that would be appreciated because there was quite a groundswell of opinion at the previous meeting that it would be better to have that outside of the last week of term to maximise attendance. And it is, it's the one meeting we have face to face, so it's nice to have as many people there as possible. Okay, I've got one item under any other business that I've agreed to raise, and it is in relation to the facilities time. Now, there has been, and Joanne will know this very well, and Sue knows this, there has been some consternation amongst the trade union reps that Schools Forum somehow stole some money and diverted it elsewhere from the facilities time. But it's simply the case that in the past we could approve the carry forwards of individual lines when we had an overall surplus, but in a deficit position because of the statutory override, we didn't actually make a decision about facilities time. We weren't able to discuss it because of the overall deficit, even if a line of the central block is in surplus. Because of the overall deficit position, it can't be carried forward. That's certainly my understanding. Callum, can you clarify that that's the case, please?
Yeah, absolutely. That is right. The other side of that is if the trade union facilities time has a deficit at the end of 25-26, equally that doesn't get carried forward either. So they are not being expected under the trade union facilities time dedelegation to make up any deficit that they accrue from this year. It is a clean slate, and the amount dedelegated needs to pay for the in-year running of the service.
Thank you for clarifying that. So in essence, after a bit of to and fro, we got it down to two requests for us to consider from the trade union reps. One was that clearing of any deficit at the end of the year, which obviously you've now confirmed. And the other request, which Bruce and I have discussed, is they would like a representative from one of the teaching unions to sit on Schools Forum. Now, we've had that in the past. I'm happy to agree to that because it is permissible within the constitution to do so. And also, I know that Hannah, who is the Unison rep, who is on Schools Forum, quite often has so much work on it's difficult for her to attend. So I think I'll just need to be clear with them about the actual remit of Schools Forum and the fact that we are almost entirely a consultative body, and we have very, very few decisions we can make. And one of the few decisions we can make is the transfer of 0.5% from the schools block into the high needs block. So I think they'll have to be clear about the terms of reference, but I don't see any harm in allowing another trade union rep to sit. Audrey, did you have a view on that?
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Chair. So I have no issue with the trade union rep. What I suggest is we are really clear about what their role is, the terms of reference, whether there are any aspects at any point that we need to be clear who does and who does not vote on which particular aspects. I think we need to be clear about that anyway. Bruce and I have had that conversation before around who can vote on which aspects and decisions of which blocks we need to just perhaps reinforce. So perhaps at the first meeting we can reinforce that for all forum members, and would probably be really appropriate to have an induction for the union rep joining the meeting, so that we can support them to be part of this group.
Thanks, Audrey. Yeah, Bruce and I have already discussed probably at the next Schools Forum meeting, having a review of the constitution of Schools Forum, making sure everyone understands the remit of the Schools Forum, and also looking about succession planning going forward in terms of chairing of the meeting and terms of reference. So again, everyone understands that as well. So I think that's something we could certainly add on to the next agenda. So just in terms of actions arising from this, I will respond to Steve Bird, who's acting on behalf of the other trade union reps, and answer the questions that they've asked. But I believe that Sue is also holding an additional meeting with them as well to clarify some of the issues that we've set.
Yeah, we'll definitely reach out, Alan, and get that arranged so that we're really clear. Because like Callum says, we still expect budgets to balance in year as well. It's not about building up a deficit for it to be written off either. So that constant monitoring of the budget and the allocation of the resources needs to be monitored carefully. So I think it'd be really good to take a separate meeting offline with union colleagues around the management of that trade union facility time.
Yeah, because equally, we can't create the expectation that if they run up a substantial deficit every year, it's going to be written off, because that obviously comes at the expense of everything else. So yeah, that still has to be paid for. So I think that's an excellent idea.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Audrey's got a hand raised.
Audrey, sorry, you've got your hand raised.
No, it's all right. So yes, I think that's a really good point. So in that review of the constitution, can we make sure we have that written in there? So that we are very clear about the expectation, and there is then everybody, including everybody here on the call, we've all agreed that we're all clear. There's probably another action there for me, which is, so we have a number of members, union members, who sit on a number of committees in Northumberland. And so let's be clear about what's going to be asked and discussed at each of those meetings. It's probably a piece of work for Joanne, David, Sue and I to think about. I'm thinking there's sometimes I don't want the question asked in 4 different places. So we just need to help colleagues understand the most appropriate forum where things are raised. So we'll be clear that this forum is exactly what we want them to do, which is around the finances, the detail, the understanding of that. And I would not expect that to be raised in other forums. And then we need to help chairs of other forums be able to say, no, that needs to be discussed here, so that we're not getting a multi-pronged or a multi-answered response that becomes complex. So I think for me, clarity around helping everybody understand the role, the function, and where particular areas of query should be raised.
Yeah, I think that's what I tried to intervene to avoid this becoming an issue at the JCC, because I said I would raise it as any other business at Schools Forum, because that's the most appropriate place for the questions to come. So I totally understand that the point you're making, Audrey, that we can't have the same question being asked at lots of different forums. That the question needs to go to the most appropriate forum, and that's down to communication with the union reps and between the union reps. They'll understand the protocols in which meeting it should be asked at. Bruce,
just going to add to what Audrey was saying. You know, the school forum essentially operates within a very tight framework defined by the Department for Education and the regulations. And I will circulate again in terms of as part of the review. But there's a really good sort of half a dozen page summary in terms of the respective powers, and that's something, you know, we'll share across all forum members, but obviously bring to the attention of the unions as part of that induction. I suggest, Audrey.
Yeah, I think I might ask ChatGTP to simplify that further so it's really clear. Okay, any other further points or anything under any other business, colleagues? Okay, so just to confirm that the date of our next meeting is Wednesday, the 26th of February. We will amend the date for the summer meeting, and just to say thank you very much for your attendance and your contributions today, and I look forward to seeing you all at 25th of February meeting. 25th of February. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah.